Our first presenter is Charles J. Morris. Charles is a PhD candidate at Pacifica Graduate Institute, currently writing his dissertation on the intersection of imagination in Tibetan Tantric Buddhism and depth psychology. He is based out of Victoria, Canada. And his presentation today is titled Jung and Non-Duality, Coincidentia Oppositorium, and Buddhist Emptiness. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Sarah, and congratulations on pronouncing that so that I don't have to. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. You let me know if you can see the slide. Looks good. Okay, awesome. Let me just move this over. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My talk will be on Jung and non-duality. And before I jump in, one of the things that I like to do recently is to just feed my talk titles or paper titles into AI image generators and see what it pops out. And just to give you a little starting image in your psyche to begin our discussion, this is what I got for this talk, which I think is very appropriate, of course. It captures, I think, effectively the juxtaposition between the non-dual state of being on the left. And whatever you know about what that means, we'll obviously get a little bit into it today, but it is this yogi at one with the universe is sort of the archetypal image. And the world of duality on the right, which I think tends to create a lot of thinking and deliberation, which can be useful and obstructive. And so I like that image of the wheels turning on the right. So why did I propose a talk about non-duality at a conference themed Jung and duality? I'd like to suggest that one of the primary primary dualities that are discussed in depth psychology, things like the conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and dark, and so forth, perhaps the duality that is most in the Jungian shadow is between duality itself and non-duality. And I think the reason that it's shadowy for us as Jungians is evident. In essence, Jungian psychology is about individuation, which is the realization of the capital S self. While the essence of the Buddhist path to enlightenment, for example, is the realization of the non-self. Yet, like so many apparent polarities, they are not necessarily contradictory. And I believe that much can be gained in bringing them into tension to create a transcendent third. In that spirit, there's three questions that I'd like to explore during our time today. First of all, what was Jung's position on non-duality? What is it? Again, some of you may have some background, but I'll just go a little bit deeper. And then third of all, what are some ideas around how Jungian psychology could benefit from a deeper understanding of non-dual awareness and its practices? So to begin to understand Jung's position on non-duality is not a simple thing, because as you know, he could say quite different things at different points in his career. And as I really liked Sonu Shamdasani's point yesterday about being very careful about what year Jung said certain things. So I want to keep that in mind as we proceed. But I think a lot of the understanding about how Jung felt about non-dualism comes down to how we think about whether he was an empiricist or whether he was a mystic. Of course, you already know where this is heading, but I'm going to start on one side of that equation and say that I think the easiest position to prove in terms of direct things he said was that he was a scientist and an empiricist because he kept saying that over and over. In parallel, it's not surprising that his psychology formed around themes of duality because these are psychic phenomena that we can study empirically. They're actual polarities, like light and darkness. From the standpoint of an empiricist, we can see why Jung shied away from explicit inclusion of non-dual states of awareness in his psychology, because it's defined by a lack of things to observe. His ambivalence towards non-duality is illustrated in 1932 in his seminars on the psychology of Kundalini Yoga, during which he commented fairly extensively on each of the 7 chakras of the subtle body in that system, from the root chakra all the way up to the crown. However, when he got to the 7th chakra at the crown of the head, which is the equivalent of pure spirit or non-duality, he kept his comments very brief, and this was one of the things he said. To speak about the 7th chakra is quite superfluous because that is merely a philosophical concept with no substance to us whatever. It is beyond any possible experience. This is an entirely philosophical concept. It is without practical value to us. So obviously to call it superfluous, merely philosophical, without practical value, could hardly be clearer. This, for him, at least at this time, was not a relevant concept or practice as far as he is concerned. Getting back to the state, 1932, this is well into his early explorations of the East, like The Secret of the Golden Flower, and yet still a good 30 years from his kind of ultimate evolution before his death in terms of exploring other lines of thought. So we'll just keep that in mind in the back of our heads. So, as we know, the real answer to whether Jung was a mystic or an empiricist is that he was both. And so we need to take both sides of Jung into the equation. And this paradox, of course, stems from what he self-described as personality number 1 and number 2 in memories, dreams, and reflections. Personality 2 for him was the mystic, and we saw a lot more of that side of him revealed in the 2009 publication of the Red Book, which he said was the basis of all of his subsequent work. I believe that to really embrace Jung the mystic, we also need to embrace non-duality, despite what he sometimes said. So before we get back to Jung the mystic, I need to talk a little bit more about non-duality. And yes, we're going to start with a blank slide because that's what you should be seeing when we talk about non-duality. So I'll be talking about it from the perspective of the Buddhist concept of emptiness, which is what I'm most familiar with. But it's also important to emphasize that it is not a strictly Eastern concept. David Miller noted that it's found just as much in Western spiritual traditions, though, quote, those who have stressed this apophatic side of the Christian tradition have not been much propagated, end quote. So Miller's use of the term apophatic is key. So for those of you who are not familiar, this describes what's called a negative theology, which means that the description of the divine is approached through negation. We can only describe what God is not. And that's in contrast to cataphatic theology, which takes the opposite approach. In contrast to Christianity, apophatic theology is the very foundation of many Eastern traditions, which is why there's a stronger kind of popular association. That's not to say that all Eastern traditions are equivalent in that respect. There's many overlapping terms used like non-duality, no self, selflessness, egolessness, emptiness, not to mention specific traditions around non-dual concepts like Dzogchen or Mahamudra from Tibetan Buddhism. While there's a lot of subtle differences that, if we want to get into that, we don't really have time today. So I'm going to treat them as largely synonymous and again, focused on the Buddhist concept of emptiness. And in particular, the emptiness of the self, because in Buddhism, emptiness is actually applied to everything. But the self obviously has the most direct correlation to Jung. So here's how one of my teachers, Geshe Kelsang Gyatso, describes the emptiness of the self. He says, our I, or self, appears to us as inherently existent, and our self-grasping mind automatically grasps at it in this way. However, the inherently existent I we are grasping at does not, in fact, exist. It is negated by emptiness. So here it's very obvious. You can see the apophatic nature of this all over this quote. The key is the negation of what he calls the inherently existent I or self. And this is really the key to any apophatic theology. We need to be precise about what is being negated. In this case, inherently existent is really key because it is pointing to the non-existence of a permanent, unchanging, and independent self. That sense of solidity is that the self is said to be empty of. As Jungian analyst and Buddhist practitioner Judith Pickering wrote, quote, "The self is not a static structure, but a process. The self is not a static structure, but a process," end quote. So problems can arise when apophatic negation is taken too far and superficial understanding of terms like emptiness or selflessness are taken too literally. Pickering also documented a clinical case where an overemphasis on non-dual meditations without a healthfully formed ego structure led to a pathological experience of non-existence. And so that's an example of taking this kind of negation too far, and you kind of go into a type of nihilism. So I think it's important that such problems be mitigated by using different images to relate to non-dual concepts other than things like a blank slide, for example. Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche explains that, quote, "Emptiness is not nothingness, but rather an unlimited potential for anything to appear, change, or disappear," end quote. This is notably similar to how some modern physicists are conceiving of empty space. Once we understand that, emptiness morphs from being a nihilistic void towards something that is the pregnant possibility for all phenomena. It's no wonder that Tibetan Buddhism symbolizes emptiness as the feminine deity Prajna Paramita, who you see on your screen now. In this way, form and emptiness are not separate in the Buddhist view, yet we can only truly understand the true nature of any form through emptiness. Gyatso uses the analogy of the appearance of blue manifesting in an empty sky, even though we know that even if we travel all the way up into space, we will never run into a blue object in the sky. So with that, we can return to Jung the mystic. To contrast the quite skeptical quote we looked at earlier, here's a translation of parts of his 7 sermons to the dead, which, like the Red Book, as you may know, was Jung writing from an almost purely visionary state. In it, he describes the Gnostic concept of the pleroma, which some of you may be familiar with. And here's how he described the pleroma. Nothing is the same as fullness. Nothing is both empty and full. We cannot say that this nothingness exists or does not exist. The eternal and infinite possess no qualities nor attributes, but it has all qualities. The pleroma is the beginning and the end of the created worlds. The pleroma penetrates the created world completely, just as the sunlight penetrates the air. So all of a sudden we go from Jung sounding quite skeptical to sounding like he could be an Eastern guru. And of course, in between these two polarities of Jung the empiricist and Jung the mystic, there's several other statements that are somewhere in between or ambiguous in their conclusions. Much of his skepticism can be traced to his understanding of, his correct understanding, I'll add, of the dangers of loss of ego consciousness too quickly or in an uncontrolled way. And yet, Jung also recognized that experiencing non-duality is a primordial urge. In describing the dangers of losing one's persona to the collective psyche, Jung used the analogy in 1928 that it can be traced to a desire to, quote, wed oneself with the abyss and blot out all memory in its embrace. A piece of mysticism which is innate in everyone as the longing for the mother, the nostalgia from the source from which we came, end quote. So along with the repetition of the theme of the feminine nature of the void, it's important to note Jung naming of this longing to return as an innate archetypal desire of existence. In Jung's view, as we know from his many other writings, we can't ignore instinctual or primordial urges. They can certainly have pathological expressions, but we also need to find ways to honor them correctly, or else they come back through the unconscious. Ultimately, to bring the two streams of thought together, we need to return to Jung's archetype of the self. If the self includes the totality of psyche, as he defined a number of times, it must also include non-dual states of awareness. As John Dowerly summarized, the divine nothingness into which the mystics merge is not a power extrinsic to the psyche. It is the primordial level of the psyche itself from which all consciousness, form, and culture derive. Commerce with divinity becomes commerce with the depths of a common psyche to which each individual center of consciousness has unmediated access. End quote. To approach the capital S self as a totality of the psyche, it stands to reason that we must learn to dramatically relativize our ego or lowercase s self. Or as David Miller paradoxically concluded, quote, self is no self, end quote. So to wind this down, I'd like to return to my fundamental thesis, which is that for psychology like Jung's that values wholeness, to leave out non-duality or to underemphasize it is to commit the foundational mistake of one-sidedness. Just as Jung labored to include the feminine and evil in our personal and collective God images, I argue that we also need to include non-duality as part of that totality and work practically to integrate it into our psyches. I'll briefly share 3 potential reasons why I think it's beneficial for us to integrate non-dual awareness and practice more proactively. There we go. First, psychology ultimately exists to heal. We all know that from personal experience, when we're in a complex, for example, our egoic self, this inherently existent self that Geshe-Kelsang Gyatso spoke about, appears very strongly. What we need, what I need in that moment is very vivid, feels very solid. From this perspective, individuation can be seen as an apophatic process. Unraveling our complexes becomes apophatic. As Judith Pickering states, quote, therapy becomes about removal of complexes, defense systems, and distorted views so that one's true nature can manifest and shine forth, end quote. Second, Jungian psychology already expands our time horizons, relating not only formative aspects of our upbringing to our current experience, but also the vast historical experiences of humankind through archetypes and the collective unconscious. The final step would be to extend that awareness to this timeless state of non-duality. As depth psychologist Jim Manganiello summarized, quote, To be able to access and experience our innermost core beyond time is to orient and inspire us to give ourselves deeply to the work of individuation in time. End quote. And third, as I'll be expanding on in my own dissertation research, I'd like to suggest that a deep appreciation of non-duality is necessary for what James Hillman called psychologizing. The essence of this soul work is to see through or deliteralize what we experience in life. To do this, we need to deconstruct the appearance of solid and objective reality that we normally see. With practice in non-dual awareness, we start to see through that solidity to their ultimately illusory and impermanent nature, so that we can interpret the events of our lives less literally and more like a dream. So to conclude, we'll return to Jung. And it turns out that there's evidence that Jung's views on non-dual awareness evolved through the end of his life, particularly after he had a near-death experience in 1960, prior to his actual passing in 1961. After that experience of the near-death experience, James Hillman's wife at the time, Kate, visited Jung and wrote the following in a letter back to James. Jung lives now in an in-between state somehow. Most often, he lets himself drop off into awake, non-directive states, leaving the ego and the mind out. He says he experiences truth as light, that it's not with the consciousness that he has preached all these years, that is not with the consciousness that he has preached all these years, but another kind of awareness on a very deep level. It means giving up a great deal to enter into the state where truth, so to say, lingers on a different level. Jung has always known about it, but not until now, really taking it on as a change in himself. So it sounds to me like Jung spent the last months of his life in an egoless and non-dual state. All right, thank you all so much for listening. And I will just